The community center in Mapogu had been open for 11 days when Amara received the first envelope. It arrived without a return address, slipped beneath the door of her office. On a Wednesday morning, before anyone else had arrived, a plain white rectangle sitting on the floor of a room. She had locked herself in the night before, which meant someone had a key she had never issued or a skill she preferred not to think about. Inside was a single photograph, printed on standard paper, not professional, not intended to impress, of her and Tae-Yang, walking along the Han River on the evening she had told him he was doing it, that she could see the shape of the work he was doing, and it looked like the hardest thing a person could do. The photograph was taken from a significant distance, which told her the photographer had been skilled, or had access to equipment that made skill less necessary. And it told her something else, something she sat with for a long time before she called Tae-Yang, which was that someone had been watching both of them, the watcher and the watched, and had wanted them to know it. There was no note, just the photograph, and written on the back of it, in very small, very neat handwriting, a single line, "How much does he actually tell you?" She did not call him immediately, and this was the thing about Amara Osei-Bonsu, that the person who sent the envelope had perhaps not accounted for, which was that she was not a woman who moved from shock to action, without first moving through understanding, because understanding was the only foundation she had ever trusted herself to build on. She sat with the photograph for 40 minutes. Then she photographed it on her phone, put the original in a drawer, and called him, not in the voice of a frightened person, not in the voice of a person performing calmly, but in the voice of someone who has already decided what the next question is. He arrived in under 12 minutes, which told her something about where he had been, or how fast his driver moved. When the call came with that specific quality of precision in her voice, and he came alone, no bayun, no security visible, though she had long understood that invisible did not mean absent. He looked at the photograph for a long time, longer than she had expected, and the length of it told her something, because Kang Tae-Yang had spent 15 years developing the discipline of not letting his face be a readable document, and the fact that something was moving behind his eyes right now meant that what he was looking at had reached him somewhere. The discipline had not fully followed him. "You recognize whoever took this?" she said. It was not a question she had learned by now. The difference between the things she needed to ask him and the things she simply needed to say out loud, until he confirmed or corrected them. He did not answer immediately, and the pause had a shape to it, a specific shape she had come to recognize, the shape of a man who is weighing not whether to tell her the truth, but how much of the truth the situation requires. And she put her hand flat on the desk between them and said, "All of it, Tae-Yang." That was the ground rule from the very first Thursday. He set the photograph down and said, "There is someone I did not tell you about." And the sentence landed in the room, with the specific weight of something that has been carried at a distance for a long time, and has finally been set down close enough to examine. "Her name is Seo Yeon-ji," he said, and he said it carefully, the way you say, the name of something complicated, with the particular care of someone who understands that the name itself is only the surface of what follows it. "She was with me for a long time," he said, "not romantically, not exactly, but in the way that people who work in the world I worked in sometimes become part of each other, in ways that don't have clean names. She was my second in intelligence operations for 6 years, and she knew everything about how I ran things, which meant she also knew where every piece of leverage was kept. And when I started dismantling it," Amara said quietly, he said yes, and the single syllable carried the weight of a much longer sentence, the kind that explains why the dismantling had been contested at every step, why certain resistances had been more sophisticated than others, why someone had always seemed to know which thread to pull. "You should have told me," she said, and he said yes. And she looked at him and said, "Is that all of it?" And he looked back at her, with an honesty that cost him something visible, and said no. "There is a ledger," he said, "not a metaphor, an actual ledger, a physical record of every transaction, every name, every arrangement that held the structure together for 15 years. And I don't have it, and I need it, because without it, there are men who believe they are protected by their inclusion in it, and will move against anyone who threatens that protection. And Seo Yeon-ji has it," Amara said, and he said, "I believe so, yes." And she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "So this photograph is her telling you that she has been watching, that she knows about me, and that you have something to lose." now that she can reach, and he said yes, that is what this is. She stood up from her desk and walked to the window, and looked at the street below, her city, the one she had mapped on foot, the one she had made account for her until it had no choice but to receive her, and she stood there long enough for him to understand that she was not deciding whether to leave. She was deciding how to proceed. What does she want? Amara said, and he said, I think she wants to remind me that I built something that cannot be fully walked away from, that the architecture of what I made doesn't simply disappear because I have decided to stop living inside it. She turned from the window and looked at him with the directness she brought to everything, and said, then we need the ledger, and he said, Amara, and she said, don't, I'm not asking to be involved, I am already involved. She put me in that photograph, that was her decision, not mine. I'm not a variable in your world, she said, and he said, I know. And she said, I'm not a pressure point, I am not a margin, I am not a person who is going to stand in this office and be managed like a risk assessment, while someone else makes decisions about my safety, and he said, I know, I know, I know. The 3 repetitions landed differently than one would have. The first was agreement, the second was apology, and the third was something else entirely, something that sounded, for the first time in her hearing of him, like a man who was genuinely afraid, not of Seo-yeon-ji, not of the ledger, not of the men who believed they were protected, but of her, of losing her specifically in the precise and particular way that a person loses someone when they have run out of ways to keep the 2 halves of their life from finding each other. Byun came to her apartment that evening, alone, which was unusual, which meant Tae-Yang had sent him rather than come himself, which meant something was happening that required Tae-Yang to be somewhere else, while Byun delivered information that could not wait. He sat across from her at the small table near her kitchen window, where she sometimes ate alone on the evenings she worked late, and he folded his hands on the table with the deliberate composure of a man who has spent 9 years preparing for difficult conversations on behalf of someone who was not always able to have them himself. He said, there are things about Seo-yeon-ji that he did not tell you this morning, not because he was hiding them, but because there are things a man cannot say about a part of his life without first deciding what version of himself he is willing for the person he loves to see. The word landed in the room between them, love spoken by Byun with the matter-of-fact quality of a man reporting a known fact, as though he were reading it from a document he had filed some time ago and never been asked to retrieve until now. She did not react to the word. She filed it in the same careful place. She filed most things that arrived before she was ready for them and said, tell me what he didn't say. Seo-yeon-ji, Byun said, did not simply leave the organization when Tae-Yang began dismantling it. She was asked to leave 2 years ago because Tae-Yang discovered that she had been conducting a secondary operation that he had not sanctioned, involving money that could not be fully accounted for, and a set of connections to interests outside Korea that raised questions he had not been able to answer fully. He handled it quietly, Byun said, not because he wanted to protect her, but because the alternative was a confrontation that would have required him to use the full weight of what he had built, which was precisely the opposite of the direction he was trying to move. And she knew that, and he believes she used that knowledge deliberately. She left, Byun said, with the ledger, and with something else, something Tae-Yang only discovered recently, which is why this is happening now, which is why the photograph came now, and not 18 months ago when they first started sitting at the corner table. Amara looked at him and said, what did she take? And Byun said, with the careful understatement of a man who understood that the next sentence would change the architecture of everything. She took files on you, not surveillance, not security monitoring. She took the record of how long he had been watching you and why, including a communication he sent to himself years ago that he never intended anyone to read. A letter, Byun said, handwritten, never sent, written on the night of your gallery, opening after the man in the well-fitted jacket made you smile the real smile. A letter that explained, with the precision of a man accustomed to writing operational reports, exactly what he felt and exactly why he believed he had no right to act on it. Amara sat very still, the way she had stood still on the wet street. After the truck, the body processing, something the mind had not yet caught up to. And then she said he doesn't know she has it. And Byun said he didn't know until 3 days ago, and has not been able to decide how to tell you. Which is why I am here instead, which is perhaps not his finest decision, but it is a human one. She did not speak for a long time, and Byun, who had learned over 9 years, the profound communicative power of well-timed silence, did not fill it. Outside, Seoul went on in the way it always went on, indifferent, luminous, moving at the velocity that swallows the uncertain, and inside her apartment, a woman who had decided 3 years ago not to let her fear make her decisions was deciding, again, what to do with information that had arrived before she had built a room for it. "Where is he right now?" she asked, and Byun said he's at the building in Seongdong-gu, the one he's been transferring, working through documents, and she said, "Does he know you're here?" And Byun said yes, and she said, "So he sent you to tell me what he couldn't?" And Byun said he sent me to tell you the truth, which is what you asked for, which is what he has been trying to give you, in the amount that he is capable of, which is more than he has given anyone, though I understand that may not be sufficient. She nodded once, slowly, the nod of someone who has received a complicated thing and chosen to hold it carefully rather than put it down. And then she said, "I need to meet her." Byun looked at her for a moment, with the diplomatic blankness she had by now learned to read, and what she read in, it was not surprise, it was something closer to recognition, the expression of a man who had anticipated this sentence, and had not yet decided whether to honor it or manage it. He said that's not what he would want, and she said, "I know," and he said it may not be safe, and she said, "I know that too," and he said, "Then I will pass that along," and she said, "Please also pass along the fact that I'm an architect. I understand structural problems, and the way to resolve a structural problem is not to manage it from the outside. You have to go into the building." She met Seo Yun-ji on a Tuesday in a café that neither of them had chosen, a neutral location arranged by Byun, with the operational care of a man who had spent 9 years arranging difficult meetings and understood that the geometry of a room could determine the direction of a conversation. Seo Yun-ji was not what she had constructed in her mind. She had not constructed anything. Specific had deliberately refused to, because she understood that the image she built before arrival would shape what she saw when she got there, and she needed to see clearly. The woman across the table was precise in the way of someone who had been trained to use precision as a form of defense, precise in her clothing, in the placement of her cup, in the way she held eye contact without blinking, at a rate that suggested it was a habit of discipline rather than a natural ease. She was also, Amara noticed, with the part of herself that noticed the things people were before they became what circumstances had required. She was also someone who had been hurt, specifically in the way that people are hurt when they have organized their entire world around something that then decided to reorganize itself without them. "I expected you to be afraid of me," Seo Yun-ji said. And Amara said, "I know." And Seo Yun-ji said, "You're not." And Amara said, "I've been not afraid of things before. I've learned it doesn't always make me right, but it makes me present, which is the most useful thing I can be right now." "What do you want from him?" Seo Yun-ji asked. And Amara said the same thing. Anyone wants from the person they've decided to build something with. "I want him to be honest. I want him to be present. I want him to stop managing the distance between who he was and who he is becoming, because that distance is where things go wrong." "And what does he want from you?" Seo Yun-ji said, and the question carried something underneath it that Amara heard clearly, something that had nothing to do with leverage, something that had been living under all of this for a long time and had finally found a room to stand in. She had been in love with him. Amara understood in the way people love things. They have helped build, with the particular, possessive grief of someone who believes their labor entitles them to the finished version of the thing, and has not yet made peace with the fact that it does not. "I think he wants the same thing I want," Amara said. And she said it gently, the way she said things when she understood that gentleness was not weakness, but precision, and that the most accurate thing was sometimes also the most careful one. "He wants to become a person who deserves to be known," she said, "and I think you know that's true. And I think part of what makes this difficult for you is that you knew him when he didn't believe it was possible, and now he does. And you did not get to be the person who showed him." Seo Yun-ji was very still for a moment, the stillness of someone who has just heard a thing they could not have predicted and cannot immediately decide what to do with. And then she said, "He wrote you a letter." "I know," Amara said, and Seo Yun-ji said, "Did he tell you?" And Amara said, "Someone told me, yes." And Seo Yun-ji looked at her and said, "Aren't you angry?" And Amara said, "About which part, the letter or the 3 years?" or the fact that he is still learning how to tell me things directly, instead of sending the person who knows him best. All of it, Seo Yeon-ji said, and Amara said yes, sometimes, and then she said, but anger isn't the most interesting thing about this situation, and I've never found it particularly useful as a foundation. There was a long silence, and then Seo Yeon-ji placed the ledger on the table between them, not dramatically, not as a gesture of surrender, but with the same practical deliberateness she brought to everything. The movement of a person who has made a decision and is executing it cleanly. I was going to use it, she said. I want you to know that. I had constructed the entire sequence of what came after the photograph, and it was precise. It would have worked, and Amara said, I believe you. I'm not giving it to you, because I'm afraid of what he would do, Seo Yeon-ji said, and Amara said, I know that too, and Seo Yeon-ji said, I'm giving it to you because you walked in here, and you looked at me like a person. And it has been a long time since someone in his world looked at me like a person first. Amara did not reach for the ledger immediately. She looked at Seo Yeon-ji for a moment, and then she said, what do you need? And the question was so unexpected that Seo Yeon-ji sat back slightly, as though the weight of the room had briefly redistributed itself. What do you mean? She said, and Amara said, you gave me something that cost you something. That transaction is not neutral. And I don't accept things from people as though they are neutral, when they aren't. So I'm asking, what do you need? Seo Yeon-ji looked at her for a long, assessing moment, the same kind of look Amara had received that first morning from Tae-Yang, the look of someone encountering a kind of person they had not previously factored into their calculations. And then she said something so quiet that Amara had to lean slightly forward to hear it. I need to stop being inside the thing I built to survive, she said, and I don't know how to do that. And I watched him not know how to do it either, for years. And then I watched you show him by simply being a person who expected better of him. And I thought I want that for myself. But no one knows to expect better of me. Amara nodded slowly, and she took the ledger, and she placed it in her bag, and she said, I know some people, not in his world, not in any world like it. People who build things, people who rebuild things. People who are very good at helping someone understand what a space can become when you stop building it around the walls that kept you safe and start building it around the life you actually want. She stood up to leave, and then she paused, and she said in the tone of someone adding a structural note to a design that is almost finished, the letter, by the way, is his to give me or not? And I would prefer he give it himself when he is ready. Please don't use it as a way to settle the account between you, because there is no account. It's already settled. She walked out into the Seoul afternoon, into the noise and the light, and the city that had made room for her on her own terms. And she pulled out her phone, and she did not call Tae-Yang yet, because she needed a few more minutes. With the shape of what had just happened before, she brought another person into it. She thought about the figure she had drawn on the corner of the community center, sketch, the small shape at the threshold, waiting to be let in. And she thought about the fact that thresholds work in both directions, that the person standing at the entrance of something is also standing at the exit of the thing they came from, and that architecture, properly understood, has always been the art of helping people make that crossing safely. She called him when she reached the Han River, the same stretch, the same light, beginning its reluctant autumn arrangement over the towers of Yeouido, and he answered before the second ring, which told her everything about where his attention had been. For the last several hours, she has the letter, Amara said. I know, he said, and she said she gave me the ledger, and he went quiet in a way that was different from his usual silences, a silence not of calculation, but of something moving through him, that he hadn't yet assembled into language. Come to the river, she said, and he said Amara, and she said, I know, come anyway. And there was a pause, and then I'll be there in 20 minutes, and she said, I'll be the one watching the light break against the towers at 6 o'clock. And she heard, very faintly, the sound of him almost laughing, which was its own kind of devastating up close. He found her exactly where she said she would be, and he stood beside her without preamble, without the architecture of an opening, without the careful preparation he had once used for every approach. She did not turn to look at him immediately. She watched the light do its brief and unrepeatable thing against the towers, the thing she had been watching on Saturdays for years, the thing he had once watched from a grey distance for 2 full hours, before leaving, before she finished. He stayed this time. He had been staying, she thought, for over a year now, in the quiet and non-cinematic way of a man who had decided to stop practicing departure, and the fact of it was still new enough to feel like something she wanted to pay attention to, something she did not want to become ordinary before she had finished understanding it. "There's something I should give you," he said, and his voice had the specific quality it had on the Thursday. He first said, "I want to stop watching from a distance." The quality of a man setting something down that he has been carrying for a very long time in a way that was not sustainable. "I know," she said, "and he said she told you, and Amara said Byun told me there was a letter. She told me she had it. I told her it was yours to give me when you were ready, and I need you to understand that I am not asking for it. I am simply telling you that the door is open if you want to walk through it." He reached into his jacket and produced an envelope. Plain, white, sealed, its edges soft, with age and handling, the edges of something that had been picked up and put down many times, without ever being opened by anyone but the person who wrote it. She took it and held it without opening it, and he said, "You don't have to read it now," and she said, "I know." And she folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket, close. And she said, "I'll read it when I'm ready to read it, and I'll tell you what I think when I'm ready to tell you, which is the same deal you've had with me from the beginning." "Yes," he said, and she turned and looked at him in the late October light, the light that Seoul produced briefly and reluctantly before winter, arrived and refused to return it, and she looked at him with the fullness she brought to everything she decided to give herself to. "You know what I've been thinking about," she said. And he said, "Tell me," and she said, "I've been thinking about the community center, about the client, who told me he wanted a building that felt like belonging, and how I kept asking myself what belonging actually is in structural terms, what it looks like when a space is built for it. And I think," she said, "it's this. It's not safety, it's not beauty. It's not even warmth. It's the experience of arriving somewhere and understanding that the building was made with you in mind, that the architect thought about you before the first line was drawn, that there is space here, specifically because someone imagined you occupying it." He was very quiet, and she said, "I've been building that, slowly, in this city for 10 years, and I built it without you. I want you to know I know that. I know my story did not miss you." And he said, "I know." And she said, "But I think it was always going to have a room in it that was shaped like you, even before I knew it. And I want you to know that you are not a renovation." The echo of what she had said to him in the cafe landed between them, not a renovation. And he stood very still in the way he had stood on this riverbank once before, when she had told him he was doing the hardest thing, the quiet and relentless thing, and let himself be seen. "You are a structural element," she said. And she said it with the gravity of someone speaking in her own language, the language she had spent a lifetime building. Precision in and structural elements are not decorative, they are load-bearing. They are the difference between a building that holds and one that doesn't, and I do not use the word casually. He turned and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and Seoul went on around them, with its noise and its light and its magnificent indifference, to the specific gravity of what was being said on its riverbank. At 6 o'clock on a Tuesday in October, "There is still the matter of the men in the ledger," he said, because he was also a person who understood structure, who understood that a foundation had to be cleared before it could bear the weight of what came after. And she said, "I know, and we'll deal with that, and there will be other things after that, and we will deal with those too." "We," he said quietly, "the way you say, a word that has just become a different kind of word than it was before." And she said, "Yes, we, that is what I said." And I said it deliberately, and I don't take structural words back. She turned and resumed walking along the river, and he fell into step beside her, no distance managed, no periphery maintained, no space between them, constructed to protect the thing that mattered most from the possibility of loss, just the river and the cold, moving in off the water, and the two of them walking into the October evening, a man who had spent 15 years building a world that did not need to be loved, finally, allowing himself to be load-bearing in someone else's, and an architect who had always known that the most important thing about a space was not what it kept out, but what it was built to hold. In her coat pocket, folded against her side, was a letter from a man who had once sat alone in his penthouse in the dark and written down, with operational precision, exactly what it felt like to watch someone love the world the way she did, and to understand with a clarity that had nowhere to go, that he was standing on the wrong side of the glass. She would read it on a Saturday morning at the kitchen table, with the autumn light coming in through the window and the city beginning to stir below. and she would sit with it for a long time, the way she sat with buildings she was learning, reading it for the structure underneath the surface, for the intention that existed before the thing was built. And she would think he was writing toward me even then. Even when he had decided the window was the only safe place to stand, he was already trying to figure out how to say the thing that the glass made impossible. And she would fold it carefully and she would place it in the drawer, where she kept the things that mattered most, not displayed, not archived, not protected behind distance, just kept close, ordinarily, and permanently of something that belongs. But the drawer could wait. The letter could wait, because the morning after she read it, Seoul would still be Seoul, and the men in the ledger would not. The men in the ledger did not wait to be dealt with. That was the first lesson of the months that followed. Power, when it understands it is being dismantled, does not idle politely in the room you have assigned it. It moves. It finds the corners you have not yet examined. It makes itself known through intermediaries and silences, and the particular cold feeling of understanding that someone has done their arithmetic and concluded that you are the variable that needs to be removed. 3 names in the ledger had the means and the motivation to act before Tae-Yang could act first. He knew their names before he opened the book. He had built the structure they lived inside, had measured their capacity for violence, the way a structural engineer measures load tolerance, and he understood, with the cold precision of someone who has spent 15 years thinking in consequences, that the window between the ledger's retrieval and his ability to use it was the most dangerous interval of his life. What he had not accounted for was Amara, not what she would do. He had learned over the course of a year of Thursdays and riverbank evenings and slow Saturday mornings, in which the city outside her window came gradually to feel like a place he was allowed to be, that accounting for Amara was a category error. She was not a variable. She was not a calculation. She was the one person in his life who had ever operated entirely outside the logic. His world ran on, and it was precisely this that had made her impossible to stop watching, and precisely this that made her now the most important thing he had ever had access to, not because of anything she could do, but because of what she had already done. She had met Seo Yeon-ji and come out of that room with the ledger and with something else, something that could not be documented or logged, or filed under any professional category he possessed. She had come out with Seo Yeon-ji's trust. It was Byun who saw it first. Byun, who had spent 9 years reading rooms on Tae-Yang's behalf and whose understanding of human architecture was as precise in its own way as Amara's understanding of the structural kind. He came to Tae-Yang 2 days after the river and said, with the careful understatement, that was his most reliable form of communication. She did something in that cafe that I don't think either of us would have thought to do. She asked Yeon-ji what she needed, Tae-Yang said. Byun looked at him with something that was almost surprise and said, you know? And Tae-Yang said, I know her. The 3 men in the ledger were dealt with in the 6 weeks that followed. Not violently, not with the instruments. His world had trained him to reach for first, but with the ledger itself, wielded with the precision of someone who understood that the most effective weapon in a room full of men, protecting themselves from exposure, is the credible threat of exposure. 2 of the 3 made arrangements. The 3rd required a conversation that Tae-Yang had in person, alone, in a restaurant in Gangnam, and the conversation lasted 40 minutes and ended with an agreement that held and continued to hold because both men understood the arithmetic and had arrived at the same conclusion. If you have been watching this story, the way Amara watched her city on foot from the inside, learning its logic until it could not withhold itself from you, then leave a comment below. Tell us what you are building toward, what threshold you are standing at. This story was made for the people standing at thresholds. Like it if it reached you. Subscribe so you are there when the next one begins. The morning the last arrangement was confirmed, Tae-Yang drove to Amara's office before she arrived. He stood in the lobby of her building, not across the street, not at the corner table, not at the periphery of any room. And he waited, which was something he had spent 3 years doing, and was only now learning to do correctly, which is to say openly, without strategy, without the architecture of distance, wrapped around the waiting to make it look like something other than what it was. She came through the door at 8:44, a roll of drawings under one arm and her coffee in the other hand, and she saw him immediately because she always saw him immediately, and her face did the thing it did. Not surprise, not performance, just the quiet recognition of someone who has learned to read a particular presence in a room and has decided she is glad when it is there. "It's done," he said, and she looked at him for a long moment, reading the structure underneath the surface, the way she read everything, and then she said all of it. And he said all of it. And she said Yeonji, and he said she has what she needs. Byun arranged it, she is out of it entirely. Amara nodded once, the slow nod of someone, receiving a complicated thing carefully. And then she said, "Come up, I want to show you something," and she walked to the elevator. And he followed without distance, without management, without the months of careful calibration that had preceded every step toward her. On her desk, spread wide, under the morning light that came in from the street below, was a new set of drawings, preliminary, unfinished, but already carrying the specific quality that made her work unmistakable, the sense that the people who would one day move through this space had been thought of carefully before. The first line existed. "A residence," she said. "Private commission. The client told me he wanted a home that felt like a decision, not a house that said wealth or status or taste, but one that said, I chose this, I chose to be here, I chose the life that fits inside these walls." She looked at him across the drawings. "I've been thinking about what that means structurally," she said. "What it looks like when a building is designed not to impress, but to hold." He looked at the drawings for a long time, at the generosity of the proportions, at the way the spaces opened toward each other, rather than away, at the small notations in the margins in her handwriting, the evidence of someone thinking carefully about what it meant to make a place for a life. Then he looked up, and she was watching him the way she had always watched him, fully, without flinching, without managing what she found. "You should know," she said, "that I read the letter." He was very still. "I read it on a Saturday morning," she said with the light coming in, "and I sat with it for a long time. And then I put it in the drawer where I keep the things that belong to me. And I want you to know that it belongs to me now, and I am not giving it back." He said nothing because there was nothing available to him in that moment. That was equal to what she had just said, and she seemed to understand this, because she did not wait for him to find words. He did not yet have. She picked up her pen and made a small mark on the corner of the new drawing. He leaned forward and saw what she had added, the same small figure she had drawn on the community center sketch a year ago, the shape at the threshold. But this time the figure was inside, not waiting to be let in, she said quietly. Already there, Seoul moved on outside the window, noise and light, and the magnificent indifference of a city that does not slow down for anyone. And inside this office made of glass and morning light, and 10 years of one woman's refusal to let herself be anything less than fully present in her own life. A man who had spent 15 years building a world that did not need to love or be loved, stood inside something new and found that it held, not perfectly, not without the weight of what had been built and dismantled and renegotiated in the months before, not without the work that both of them understood was not yet finished and might never be the kind of finished that requires no more attention, but it held. And that, Amara had once told him, describing a building she admired, is the only thing that matters in the end. Not how a structure looks from the outside, not how it was built, or what it cost, or what it replaced. Only whether, when the weight arrives, and the weight always arrives, it holds. What would you have done if someone spent 3 years watching you from a distance, afraid to reach for the thing they wanted most? Would you have walked to their table the way she did? Or would you have stayed safe across the room the way he did? Tell us in the comments. Share this with someone who is still standing at the periphery of their own life, because sometimes the only thing people need is someone to remind them that the table has room and the chair has been empty long enough. And the most difficult thing a person can do is also the most ordinary, to simply walk across the room and sit down.